During the civil rights era of the 1960s, while African Americans, Chicanos, and Native Americans were fighting for their rights, Puerto Ricans in cities across the U.S. were also coming together to advocate for their own community and for all the poor and oppressed peoples of the world. Modeling themselves after the Black Panther Party, these young Puerto Ricans, many of them college students, formed the Young Lords Party, a group dedicated to helping Puerto Ricans and other peoples who lived in poor urban neighborhoods all over the U.S., while also protesting against international problems like war and imperialism. From their official establishment as an organization in 1968 up until the mid-1970s, the Young Lords fought for the rights of the urban poor through many different forms. They organized protests, set up easily accessible health clinics, pushed city politicians to pass laws, and united with other communities of oppressed peoples in order to promote the issues they all faced. Through the actions of their party's different chapters across the U.S., the Young Lords were able to provide important services for Puerto Ricans and the urban poor as a whole, while also politically organizing these communities to address domestic and international issues. The Young Lords were originally formed as a Puerto Rican street gang in 1960 in the mostly Puerto Rican neighborhood of Lincoln Park in Chicago. The group was later reformed into a civil rights organization by Jose Chacha Jimenez in 1968. A member of the original Young Lords gang, Jimenez became politically conscious after sharing a jail cell with Fred Hampton, leader of the Chicago Black Panther Party. Following the example of Hampton and the Panthers, Jimenez returned to his neighborhood and reorganized the Young Lords, uniting them to protest the city's racist urban renewal plans. The Lords were ultimately unsuccessful in their efforts. The protests did bring the group more attention and helped them gain a small following. A few months after the protest, the Young Lords took control of the local church that refused to let the group host their social programs. Renaming it the People's Church, the young Puerto Ricans set up their Serve the People programs, which offered everything from daycare and a health clinic to a free breakfast program. The group was eventually forced by the police to leave the property. Their roots had already taken hold. The Young Lords Party was now active within Chicago, promoting Puerto Rican liberation, community control, and pressuring the city's institutions to respond to their concerns. The Young Lords were heavily influenced by the Black liberation movement, especially the Black Panther Party. In addition to adopting their military style of dress, the Lords also embraced the Panthers' ideology of the liberation of all working-class people. They looked past racial differences in order to work together for the urban poor everywhere. The Lords eventually united with the Panthers and the Young Patriots, a group of white radicals, to form the Rainbow Coalition, reaching across racial lines in order to promote the rights of poor working-class peoples. This union of poor peoples from different racial and ethnic groups was a powerful sign of solidarity, especially at a time when racial tensions were high within the U.S. The Young Lords welcomed members of all backgrounds to the organization. Mexican Americans, Dominicans, African Americans, Cubans, and many more identities were represented within the movement's ranks. Former Young Lords member Iris Morales explained this racial unity best when she said, "The Young Lords were committed men and women who had experienced racism and exploitation in the U.S. The strength of the organization was in transcending our race differences and understanding the power of collective action." Because of the group's deep cultural roots in Puerto Rico, the Young Lords Party fought for the rights of Puerto Ricans both in the States and on the island. Puerto Rico's complicated relationship with the U.S. began after the Americans took control of the island in 1898 during the Spanish-American War. The rapid industrialization of the island in the 1940s made conditions difficult for most Puerto Ricans, especially for those living in the countryside. This led to the migration of thousands of Puerto Rican workers in the 1950s, as they fled high unemployment in Puerto Rico and obtained factory jobs in cities like New York and Chicago. The Young Lords, many of which were the sons and daughters of this migration generation, saw their poor working and living conditions as a product of this unequal relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and spoke out against it. They called for self-determination for Puerto Ricans and for liberation on the island and inside the U.S. They also extended their support to all Latinos and third world peoples, calling for their liberation and self-determination from imperial nations like the U.S. Through the support of Puerto Rican freedom and the liberation of all oppressed peoples, the Young Lords were able to gain much support for their group, giving a voice to those who had none in the U.S. From takeovers and protests to solidarity with Puerto Ricans back home, the Young Lords Party gave Puerto Ricans in barrios across the U.S. an opportunity to organize themselves against the racist and oppressive institutions in the country, to fight for their civil rights. Through the party, young Puerto Ricans were given the chance to create real change within their communities. The garbage offensive in East Harlem in 1969 helped clean the streets of the barrio through an act of defiance. The takeovers of the People's Church in Chicago and the Methodist Church in Harlem provided important social programs to the community. And the promotion of Puerto Rican culture and freedom for all Latinos gave a voice to those who were being silenced and ignored. The legacy of the young lords still lives on today through the celebrations of Puerto Rican culture and heritage that are held every year across the U.S., promoting the same values and cultural pride that the lords did 50 years ago.